Hello, I'm Roger Bisbee from the Skill Builder channel, back with another little rant. But before I rant, I just want to say to you, we now have a newsletter which is completely free. You can sign up for it. It will keep you up to date with all the videos we've got coming up, and also give you the latest information on the industry and product reviews and offers, and maybe even free stuff. Who doesn't like free stuff? In this rant today, I want to talk about flooding, because once again, we see those depressing pictures of people's homes flooded out. Television reporters love to stand there deep in the water, giving us the full drama. We see the people in their homes trying to mop up. Another thing that's quite inevitable these days, usually a woman berating the politicians, saying, you need to do more. And maybe they do need to do more. Heavy rain is, I'd say, slightly out of their control, but of course they could do things to dredge rivers and put in flood defences. If you've got a lovely old cottage sitting by a river and it rains a lot, then there is a good chance that you're going to get flooded out. But the thing that really concerns me here is all the pictures of the new builds, the housing estates which have only been built in the last 10 years, completely underwater. And that definitely is somebody's fault, because just over a year ago the government announced that it was going to be tightening up the planning regulations to try and mitigate some of the risks of flooding. It's going to require house builders to do more to put in anti-flood defences. The pictures that I've seen recently of housing estates, brand new houses, completely underwater in places like Norwich and Leicester and other places in the country, where builders have taken cheap land that would previously never have been built on, and they've built houses with little or no regard for future flooding. A resident in Norwich was telling me recently that what the builders had done to actually mitigate the flooding in one particular housing estate had simply moved it over the road to the other development. Now, you can actually build in floodplains. It's been done for centuries, and I was recently in Long Island and I saw houses there built on stilts where the sea just washed in under the houses from one side to the other during high tides, and the houses are perfectly okay, they can withstand that. Obviously you've got to move your car out the way when that happens, but other than that, perfectly viable. You see this all over the world. You see houses built on stilts. So just raising those houses a little bit further out of the ground may have actually saved a lot of people a lot of heartache. But of course it costs money. If we're to believe the predictions about climate change and rising sea levels, you have to question the building of some of those houses in the first place, because even if you built them on stilts, according to the predictions of the meteorologists, the sea levels are going to rise so high that you might as well kiss goodbye to the whole of Norfolk. So why the hell they're building all these great estates around Norwich if they accept the fact that sea levels are going to rise baffles me completely. There will come a time when the Norfolk Broads covers the whole of Norfolk. So even if they are putting in flood measures, they clearly aren't working. And it's very difficult to fully appreciate just how miserable it is when your house has been flooded out. I mean, first of all, you just stand there helpless while the water washes through. Then when the water's gone, you've got that futile exercise of trying to mop up and clean out all the mud, and then the skips arrive and you put all your worldly possessions into the skip, and then the house has to dry out. This could take as much as 6 months. And then you've got the refurbishment, and all the time you're sitting there in your bed and breakfast or your caravan while all this is going on. And then eventually you get back into your lovely new home, and every time it rains you're sitting there like a nervous wreck, and maybe moving your furniture upstairs and going through that whole process again. How people survive that, I really don't know. And if I lived in one of those houses, I would call my eldest son Noah and send him on a boat building course. And if, quite understandably, they decide that they really can't stand the stress of living in a flood zone, they try to sell their house, only to find that it's very, very difficult to sell a house that's been flooded out. And of course we have warranties on new builds for structural defects, and at the moment that's a 10-year warranty, but I'm told that it's going to be extended to 15 years in the near future. But you have to ask, is building in a flood zone a structural defect? I would say it certainly is, but the insurance companies beg to differ. The people that underwrite those new home warranties are saying, no, that's not a structural defect, that's an act of God or something else. These are the same insurance companies that would refuse you home and contents insurance if you've already been flooded out. The reason that they do offer insurance is because the government has forced their hand by getting them to contribute to a £135 million annual fund, which they call the Flood Re, or Flood Reinsurance to give it its full name. And the idea of this is that everybody through a levy puts in some money into a fund, and if the insurance company covers that property and it happens to flood, then it is the Flood Reinsurance scheme that pays out. And of course, where does that money come from? You've guessed it, it comes from you and me through the increased insurance premiums, because if the insurance companies have got to pay a levy into that fund, they're going to get it from the people that live on top of the hill as well as the people who are living in the flood zones. We're all picking up the tab for builders, property developers who've built housing estates on areas that they kind of know are going to flood. And even if that's deemed a 1 in 50 year occurrence, that's no consolation at all. So either they build those houses higher in the ground, or they dredge the rivers, divert the water courses, or do something else. But of course all of that costs money, and one thing builders don't like is spending money. The other worrying thing about the flood reinsurance scheme is that it's actually a short-term measure. It's due to end in 2039, which sounds a long way off, but if you consider somebody who's got a 30-year mortgage, then having the insurance that runs out halfway through is not very good. Once that flood reinsurance scheme ends, they say that what they're going to do is have risk reflective pricing, which means that if they see a property that looks like it's going to be flooded or has been flooded, the premiums will go through the roof, and there's no avoiding that. So if you've bought a property which is in a flood area, at the moment you're enjoying the benefit of that flood reinsurance scheme. When it ends, that's going to be a hard blow. So that's all in the future, but if you happen to be living in an area which is prone to flooding and you have an insurance policy under the flood reinsurance scheme, the thing you really want to be looking out for is the Build Back Better, the BBB scheme, because when an insurance company does pay out on a flood claim, they will think about building back better. In other words, putting in more flood defences, flood doors, all kinds of non-return valves, and maybe even building walls around the property to reduce the risk of flooding. But of course, what they're actually doing is they're using that money from the flood reinsurance scheme to improve those properties to reduce their risk. One thing those insurance companies aren't is stupid. The best solution to all this is not to buy a property that's prone to flooding in the first place. It sounds obvious, but I was contacted by somebody recently who was looking to buy a home, and she wanted some advice on various forms of heating. Now, this home was on a spit of land which was between a river and a canal, and I looked at this property, and the first thing I did was type in on the government's website to see what the risk of flooding is. And if you've never done that, you can simply type in your postcode and it will tell you what the risk of flooding is in your area. They don't necessarily get it right, but if they say that it's a very low risk, you're living on top of a hill, or it's a high risk if you're living beside a river. So I said to her, do not touch that house with a barge pole. Don't worry about the heating, it's the flooding you want to be concerned about. And of course, a barge pole may be the very thing that they do touch it with, because the canal was so close to the house you could simply reach out and touch it. I got the feeling that her heart was set on that property. It was a lovely looking place beside a lovely canal, little pub up the road, river behind, and as much as I did to try and talk her out of it, I'm fairly sure she went for it. So to that viewer, I hope that you're warm, dry and comfortable, and to every viewer, I hope you're warm, dry and comfortable. But if you have been flooded out and you want to tell us about it, I'm sure that people will be interested to know your experiences, and if you've got any advice, we'd be keen to hear that too. And don't forget to sign up for that newsletter, because it will help the channel grow and make sure that we're here in the future.